Wow.
I'm saying today after Shir, yeah, just like close it. Everything needs a rest every once in a while. All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsor, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tammuz, Rabbi Naftali Tilson of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Sherman and Shoshos this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of his dear parents, Rabbi Yonah ben Avram Leib and Rivka Bas Yaakov, as well as in the schus that our entire Shem Eretz Hashem should be zocha to continue to learn and Eretz Hashem finish Shas Bekarov. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Binyamin and Elana Levin, in honor of the birth of a granddaughter, Liora Sar Levin. Eretz Hashem she should be zocha to grow to an incredible Bas Yisrael Mea Ve'esim Shanim Tovos. And we dedicate our learning in the schus of Refuah Shlema for Zecharia Dov Ben Peril Shira. He should have a complete refuah together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. And with that, let us begin. An incredible daf ahead of us. Today's daf is Mem Daled 44. We are picking up Eretz Hashem at the Mishnah on Mem Gimel Amud Beis 43b. The Mishnah says as follows: Hamocher Avdo la'ovdei kochavim. If a person sells his Eved Kinani to Oved Kochavim, to a non-Jew, l'chutz la'aretz, or for that matter, again, he sells his Eved Kinani to chutz la'aretz, to diaspora, Yatza ben Chorin. The Eved automatically goes free. Eved automatically goes free. Now, what's the pshat with this? Take a look at Rashi. Yatza l'cherus. In Baruch Min Oved Kochavim, so possibility number one is that, according to Rashi, is, let's say again, I have an Eved Kinani, I go ahead and I sell him to an Oved Kochavim, or I sell him to a Chutz La'aretz, and then the Eved subsequently runs away. So Halacha L'maisa, the Mishnah says, the Eved does not come back to me, his original master, rather the Eved is automatically emancipated. The other possibility, Rashi says, Shekansua Bezin Levdoso, or what the Mishnah means to say is, if I go ahead, there is a rabbinic prohibition to sell my Eved Kinani to either a Gentile master or to sell him to Chutz La'aretz. And if I do either of those two things, I have an obligation to redeem him from that new master. And not only do I have an obligation to redeem him, but what? When I redeem him, I have to emancipate him. When I redeem him, he automatically goes free. Now, what's the pshat with this? This obviously is a rabbinic penalty, Rashi says. Hoil v'tkul min hamitzvos. Because at the end of the day, by selling him to Chutz La'aretz or by selling him to a Gentile master, I have removed the Eved from the performance of mitzvos. This is incredible. So we'll say, what's the pshat? So obviously, if I give him over to a Gentile master, his ability to go ahead and perform mitzvos has obviously become significantly curtailed. And he says furthermore, so ultimately, I will say furthermore, even just the removal from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, right? Moving the slave from Eretz Yisrael to diaspora, ultimately removes him from mitzvos as well. Now, that could be understood on two different levels. That could be understood on a simple level, that remember in Eretz Yisrael, you have certain mitzvos which are dependent on the land, which cannot be performed outside of Chutz La'aretz, outside of Eretz Yisrael. Furthermore, the other possibility is, remember, there is a school of thought that says, in general, the obligation to perform mitzvos only applies within Eretz Yisrael. Mitzvos that we do outside of Eretz Yisrael are simply training for when we are in Eretz Yisrael. Either way, by selling the slave from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, I have in some way diminished his mitzvah performance capacity. So therefore, that's the common denominator over here. Fascinatingly enough, by selling my slave either to a Gentile master or to Chutz La'aretz, I have diminished his ability to properly perform mitzvos. Therefore, there's a rabbinic penalty that I'm obligated to go ahead and redeem him. That's part of the penalty number one. And penalty number two, or second part of that penalty is, I would have thought after I redeem him, okay, so now what? He's mine again. No, he's not mine. Ultimately, again, I have an obligation to redeem him, but now he goes free. Incredible. Says the Gemara. If one sells his Eved Kinani to an Ovid Kochavim, the Eved goes free. V'tzarach get shichra me'rabba rishon. But there is still a get shichra, a document of emancipation is required from the original owner. From the original owner. When is that so? Shelo kasav alav ono. I will say, when do you need to get shichra? When is that required? When a shtar ono wasn't written. Alav kasav alav ono, zeo shichruro. But if the master wrote an ono, then ultimately, again, that represents the document of emancipation. I says, my ono, what's an ono? On Rav Sheshas, the kasav lehachi, l'chesheti barach mimenu, einli esek bach. So I'll say, for example, so now this is a very important halacha. So the Gemara is introducing me to is this idea that step one is I violated a rabbinic prohibition and I sold my Eved Kinani either to a Gentile or to Chutz La'aretz. That's the prohibition, right? The penalty is I have an obligation to redeem him. Now the Gemara says, by the way, when you redeem him, you have to give him a get shechrer, to which Rav Sheshas qualifies this and says that's only so if you didn't write a shtar ono. What's a shtar ono? If I went ahead and I sold my Eved, and I said to the Eved, listen, you are sold to the Gentile master, to Chutz La'aretz, and if you run away, don't come back to me. Don't come back to me. I will say that is effectively Ishtar Shechrer, right? That is effectively a document of emancipation. So in that kind of case, if I wrote the ono after I redeem him as a result of my rabbinic obligation, I don't have to write another get shechra for him. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Tanabanon, lava alav mina oved kochavim. If ultimately one went ahead, so I'll say this. So the case over here is I own an Eved Kinani. I collateralized him. So I used him as collateral for a loan for an Oved Kochavim. So I'll say, so I borrowed money from Joe, the Oved Kochavim, and now what happens is I secured the debt with my Eved Kinani. Okay, so I'll say, now watch this. Kevan shas la Oved Kochavim nimuso yatsa lecherus. Once the Oved Kochavim does his nimuso on the Eved goes free. I asks the Gemara, my nimuso, what does that mean? Amrafun Bar Yehuda, Nashki. What does it means the Nashki? What's the Nashki? Look at Rashi. It's about 3 lines down from before the lines get wide. Nashki, Choseim, the Simen Avdos Shetolin Avadim B'Tzavarim. So I'll say, so apparently it was common that if you had an Eved, what you would do is you would like hang something around their neck. Right? So a Nashki means like a necklace or like a seal that they would wear, indicating that they were owned by a particular master. So here's what's interesting. In this case over here, all I've done is I've collateralized my Eved. I have not sold him. I've simply pledged him as collateral. Even that collateralization, once the Oved Kochavim, so to speak, hangs his sign, right, which represents some level of ownership around the neck of the Eved goes free. Says the Gemara, Masir Rav Sheshas, 1 second. Harisin V'achachiros v'arise bate avos. So we'll say, so aris is a sharecropper. Chachiros, literally, again, I will say, are renters. Now remember, Rashi points out over here, these were different types of agricultural arrangements. Rashi says, an aris is someone who worked the land and gave a percentage of the crop ultimately to the owner. Chachiros is a type of rental agreement, Rashi explains, where there's a fixed amount of rent per year. Arise bati avos were inherited sharecropping agreements, and Oved Kochavim Shamashkan Sadeo li Yisrael. And Oved Kochavim, ultimately again, who pledged his field to a Jew, in other words, as collateral, Afa Pisha Asolo Nimuso, even though again the Jew put his Nimuso on it, Petura Mina Ma'aser. I will say these are all examples of land in Eretz Yisrael that would not be subject to Meiser. I will say, just again, we're not going to delve into this too much, but just keep this in mind. There is a fascinating machlokes. We actually touched on this, I think, last week, about whether or not Gentile ownership of land in Eretz Yisrael removes the sanctity of the land. Remember again, why is that an important discussion? Whether or not the agriculture will be subject to Trumas and Maisrus. So here what the Gemara is saying is essentially you have Gentile-owned land in which you have a Jewish sharecropper or a Jewish renter, or for that matter, again, it's Jewishly held collateral. In all of these cases, Afa Pisha Asaloni Muso, that's the part we're after over here. Even though, right, the Jew put his nimuso on it, Petura Mina Meiser. the land is still subject to Meiser. So I'll say, what do you see from here? So the Gemara says, nashki, sadavas nashki. And I'll say, if you say nimuso represents something you wear around the neck, so I don't say, can you put something around the neck of the land? It doesn't make any sense. Amar Rav Sheish says zman. Rather, Rav Sheish says, I will say, what does it mean? It means zman. I will say, what does it mean, zman? That halacha l'maisa nimuso means, even though there is a date upon which that collateralized land becomes the property of the Jew, nevertheless, the land will not be subject to the obligations of Trumas and Maisrus. To which the Gemara says, Kasha zman azman. Lo kasha hadimati zmane hadalo mati zmane. To which the Gemara says, if that's the case, halacha l'maisa, there's going to be a contradiction between zman and zman, because it's said by the Eved, once the Oved Kochavim puts his nimuso, which sounds like zman, that time that he could collect the collateral, around the neck of the Eved, so to speak, it becomes the property of the Oved Kochavim. Yet by land, it doesn't become the property of the Jew. To which the Gemara says, it's not a contradiction. When the actual date for collection of collateral comes, then collateral becomes property of the call it the lender, right? The lender, so to speak. And then again, if it's an Eved, ultimately again, it becomes property of the Gentile. And if it's the land, it becomes property of the Jew. Ela gabe Eved. So I don't understand. If you have a situation, I will say, of an Eved owned by a Jew that was collateralized for a debt for a non-Jew, and now the Jew defaults on the debt, and the time for the collection of the Eved comes about. So does anyone need to say that now this is an Eved owned by a non-Jew, and the knas, the penalty, as espoused in the Mishnah, kicks in? That's obvious. To which the Gemara says, Ella, rather, we'll see, you have to talk about both cases where the particular date did not yet come. V'lo kasha, halagufa, halapera. And both are talking about two different cases. One is talking about actual physical ownership, and one is talking about actual, again, ownership of the peros. V'bay sema. The other passage was at top of Memdalid. V'bay sema. B'shalava almanas lamashkino. But see, the other possibility is that we could be talking about a case where halacha l'maisa, the loan took place with the condition to receive collateral, but the collateral itself never actually materialized. So we'll say, without getting lost in some of the details over here, just understand what it is that we're emerging from. And what we're going to do is, we're going to do the Rambam in one fell swoop when we get to the end of this sugya, because the Rambam groups all of these particular halachas together. What we need to take from this right now is, number one, we have our rabbinic penalty, right? What's our rabbinic penalty? Ultimately, you go ahead and you sell your slave, your Eved Kinani, to either a Gentile master or to Chutz La'aretz. That slave is going free. That's the rabbinic penalty. You're obligated to redeem him, and then you have to free him, okay? Right, important qualification. You have to go ahead and give him a get shichrer, except when what? You wrote a shtar ono. What shtar ono? Where essentially he said to the Eved, I'm selling you, and if you run away, do not come back here. That is effectively a shtar shichrer in and of itself. The Gemara just pointed out that it would appear that halacha l'maisa, in a case of collateralized avodim, if the lender went ahead and somehow laid claim to the Eved already, that may result in immediate emancipation as well, to be determined by the Rambam. Let's go. We'll say 44a, second line down from the top. Mem Dalam Lav. Tana Banan. Gavo b'chovo o shelakho sikrikun lo yatsa lecherus. So it's a very interesting case. Let's say I borrowed money from a Gentile. And what happens? The Gentile took my slave as payment for his debt. Or sikrikun. We'll say sikrikun ultimately again is like is a thief, or we'll call it a thief. Rashi says over here is sikrikun. Sikrikun is bisha sheiswa mufkarin lahariga. V'amar ovid kochavim sa karkazu o evezeh. So I'll say sikrikun represents someone who has like a lot of power over me to kill me, right? And he says, listen, I'm taking your Eved. So I'll say, what's the halach in these kind of cases? Lo yatsa lecherus. The Eved doesn't go free. So Gemara says, I don't understand. Now, I understand case number two. Why? Because in case number two, the Eved is being taken forcibly from me, right? I'm not giving over the Eved, he's being taken from me. But in case number one, What's the problem over here? Right, in case number one, in case one, I will say, if he's being collected as a debt, I don't understand why he automatically goes free. I'm sorry, I understand, let me take a step back. In case number one, where he's being taken as payment for the debt, why would the Eved not go free in that case? Or minu, the Gemara says, Harisha ansu beis hamelech garno. So listen to this, we'll say a different kind of case. If let's say again, the king took my produce against my will, im bichovo, if he's taking it to satisfy a debt that I own, chayev la'aser, then I'm obligated to separate out trumas maestros. Im ba'an poros, pater la'aser. However, if he's just taking it because he's the king and he can take whatever he wants, then I'm not obligated to tithe. So we'll say what that sounds like is, if something is being seized from you in satisfaction of a debt that you owe, then normative halacha kicks in. So if that's the case, if someone seizes my eved because I owe money, then the knas of the Mishnah should kick in and the eved should be automatically emancipated. To which the Gemara says, "Shiny hasam to come shile." I will say it's different in the case of Meiser, because I will say when the king seizes my debt, my granary, my produce, in satisfaction of a debt, I am benefiting from that because technically speaking, the amount that I would have had to separate out for Trumas and Maestros is now going to satisfy my debt. Tashwan damarav hamocher avdu parhanag. Oved kochavim yotza lecherus. So we say if a person goes ahead and sells his eved to a parhanag. Now, we'll say, what's a parhanag? Over Rashi is kasada lavod avodas hamelech azman ploni v'lashuv. So we'll say a parhanag is someone who extorts. Someone who extorts. So we'll say over here, I'm selling my eved to an akum who is an extortionist. So what's the halacha? Yatsa lecherus. Ultimately, we'll say the eved goes free. Now, why does the eved go free? Hasam havele lefayis v'lo payis. Because I will say, here's the good thing about extortionists is you could go and appease them with something else. You should have given him a different piece of property, right? You chose to give him the eved. So because you chose of your own volition to give him the eved, ultimately, again, the eved does not go free. So we'll say, I just want to point out what the Gemara seems to be highlighting over here, which is that it is only when you sell or give the eved willingly that the knas, that the penalty of the Mishnah kicks in. But if the eved is totally seized against your will, then the knas, the penalty, does not kick in. Says the Gemara Gufa, Amarav, Hamocher Avdol Paranag Oved Kochavim. If a person goes ahead and sells his eved to a Gentile extortionist, Yatza lecherus, ultimately the eved goes free. My havalei me'aved, but what should I have done? The guy's an extortionist. Havalei lefayis v'lo. You should have appeased him with a different piece of property, but because you didn't do so, ultimately, again, there is liability for that. Incredible. But Rabbi Yirmiyah, machar l'shloshim yomau. But say, what happens if I sold my eved to an akum for 30 days? So this is an interesting case. So on one hand, I'm selling my eved to an akum, but on the other hand, it's only for a limited amount of time. So does the knas, does the penalty of the Mishnah kick in? So Tashma da'amarav, hamocher avdol paranag ovid kochavim. If a person goes ahead and sells his eved to a paranag ovid kochavim, ultimately again to a non-Jewish extortionist, yatz lecherus, has eved goes free. Hasam beparanag ovid kochavim she'eno chozeres. The reason over there is because once I sell it to the extortionist, then Rose say what? The evid's not coming back. Evid's not coming back. Rose say, right? In this case, this situation is different. Why is this situation different? This is a timed sale, right? I'm only selling for 30 days. So what about the following case? Machro chutz mi malachto. So this is an interesting case. What happens if I sell my eved to an oved kochavim, but with the exclusion of his work? In other words, so I say to Avik Kochavim, I'm selling him to you, but you can't work him. You can't work him, or you can't receive benefit from his labor. All right, Mao, chutz mina mitzvos. Or what happens if I go and I sell to Avik Kochavim and I say, Avik Kochavim, you can go ahead and I'm selling you my Eved Kanani, but he has to be able to perform mitzvahs, right? Chutz mi Shabbos as yamim tovim. I'm selling you my Eved Kanani, but ain't gonna work on Saturday, right? He can't work on Shabbos, he can't work on Yom Tiv. Okay, Mahu, Leger Toshav, L'Yisrael Mumar, Mahu. What happens if I sell my Evet Kanani to a Ger Toshav? Let's remember again, Ger Toshav is a non-Jew who lives in Eretz Yisrael, observes Sheva Mitzvos B'nei Noach, and ultimately again sublimates his self to the system of halacha. Or Ali Yisrael Mumar. I will say, what happens to a Jew who's an apostate? Right? Mahu, Lekusi, Mahu. What about if I sell him to a Kusi? So we'll say, so these are all non-classical cases of a sale. So what happens in all these situations? The Gemara says, Pashot Miha, Chada. Out of all these, I can answer at least one. Ger Toshav Harehu Ka'oved Kochavim. So I'll say, so one thing I know for sure, a Ger Toshav is an Akum, which is actually very interesting, right? A Ger Toshav, I will say, is, remember again, so a Ger Toshav who actually is not an Akum, right? Remember again, Akum is literally is an Oved Kochavim, Oved Komazal, right? Someone who's worshiping idolatry. A Ger Toshav Dafka is not worshiping idolatry. Yet what the Gemara is saying is, for the purposes of this halacha, a Ger Toshav ultimately again is considered to be an Akum. To which the Gemara says, Pashmi Achada Ger Toshav Harei Ka'oved Kochavim. Kusi B'Yisrael Mumar, Amalei Ka'oved Kochavim, Amalei K'Yisrael. What about a Kusi and a Mumar? Ultimately, and I will say, so that's a machlokes. So I will say, see, interestingly enough, what you see here is as follows. So I will say, so number one, pretty much all of these questions that began from the time of a timed sale, what if I just sell them for 30 days? Or what if I just sell them with all of these exceptions? I'm selling my avocado, but you can't work him. I'm selling my avocado, but he's not going to work on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So do all of these cases trigger the knas or not? So the Gemara says, Teku. The only question the Gemara says that does resolve is selling him to a Ger Toshav is the equivalent of selling him to an Akum. Incredible. So, Evet Shipa Asma Lagayasos was an interesting case. What about an Eved who allowed himself to be captured? Eved who allowed himself to be captured, Ein Rabbi Yachal Lotzio, Lo B'dini Yisrael Lo B'dini Avdikam. So we'll say, and now the master doesn't have the ability to extract him either using Jewish law or Gentile law. So again, we'll say step one is the Eved allow himself to be captured. Step two, the Jewish master, does not have any legal recourse by which to extract him from his captivity. Ma'u she'ital is damav. Is he allowed to go ahead and at least get payment for the Eved? So I will say, this is a very interesting case. Look what's happening over here. So, right, I own an Evet Kanani. My Evet Kanani allows him to go ahead and get, right, my Evet Kanani allows himself to get captured by Gentile captors. I can't extract him. Not in our laws, not in secular law, I can't extract him. But captors aren't all bad. What are they willing to do? They're willing to pay me. They're willing to pay me, right? Okay, boss, we all live with contradictions, right? They're willing to pay me. So now, what's the shaila? Can I accept the money? Now what's at play over here? What's at play over here is, well, if I accept the money, then what have I effectively done? What have I done? I've sold my Eved to a non-Jew, which is prohibited. On the other hand, I didn't sell my Eved to a non-Jew. My Eved was taken captive by a non-Jew, and I have no recourse through which or by which to extract my Eved. So I've already said there's a loss. Does the loss have to be a total loss that I can't accept any money? Or no, I didn't orchestrate this situation, and therefore, again, I should be able at least to be made whole by getting the money. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Puk aim mechiltecha. Suppose this is incredible. So this was the shaila posed in the base medrash. Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Zrika, Puk ayin b'mechiltech. Go ahead and examine your halachas. Right? In other words, review your learning and see if you could find an answer to this. Nafak dak va'ashkach. Sure enough, what happened? Rabbi Zrika so went ahead and reviewed his learning, and he found the following: the sanya hamocher beisola ovekochavim damav asurin. But say if you sell your home in Eretz Yisrael to a non-Jew, any proceeds from that sale ultimately again are asur. So let's say if you look at Rashi, Rashi says over Amocher Beisoli Ovid Kochavim Be'eretz Yisrael Do Amar Kra Lo Sichanim Lo Sitin Lehem Chaniya Bekarka. So ultimately, again, this is talking about a situation. So again, in Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to sell property to a non-Jew. So if one went ahead and illegally sold his home to a non-Jew, the proceeds of the sale are asr. What happens if you have a non-Jew who forcibly extracted property from a Jew? And the Jew has no legal recourse, neither in Beis Din or secular court. Mutar litol as damav. You are allowed to go ahead and accept money for the sale. The kosef umala ba'arkos shalahan. And also you can even go ahead and draft the sale document in their court, because it's as if you're saving it from your hand. In other words, I will say, which is an expression that means the Jew is allowed to get money for this. Why? Because again, he didn't orchestrate or facilitate the sale. This was done against his will, and if he doesn't take the money, it's a complete loss. It's a complete loss, and like this, the Gentile walks away totally enriched. Number one, he got the property. Number two, he keeps the money. So I'll say, so what do you see from here? What do you see from here? You see from here that when there is an illegal transaction that is foisted upon you, right, that you do not orchestrate, you are allowed to accept money for the transaction. Now again, I will say, don't apply that to every case in halacha, because it doesn't, but again, in these type of situations where you have a prohibition to do something, someone did it against your will, it sounds like you're allowed to go ahead and receive payment for the transaction. To which the Gemara says, 1 second. The Dilma, Hanimili bias, ki dechevon de lo sagi le below bias, lo asila zabune. So I'll say maybe it's only in the case of the home, right? In the case of the home, where I'm not allowed to sell a home to an akum in Eretz Yisrael, but now the akum took it, I'm allowed to take money. Why? I both say, we're not concerned that if we allow you to take the money, you're going to come to sell your home proactively. Why? Because a person needs a home, and they're not going to come to sell their home to an akum. I would say maybe by an eved, even though now the akum forcibly took the eved on his own. Perhaps you should be concerned that if we allow you to go ahead and what? If we allow you to go ahead and accept money, maybe you'll come to proactively sell the eved. Although, or maybe that's not a concern. Shalachlu Rabbi Ami. Mini Aybarnasan, Torah Yotza L'chol Yisrael, go ahead and disseminate this halacha to all of Klal Yisrael. Evet shehipil asma legayasos. If a slave allowed himself to be captured, vein Rabbi Yochel Lohotzio, Lo B'dinei Yisrael, Lo B'dinei Ovei Kochavim, and the master doesn't have the ability to go ahead and what? And extract him, neither through Gentile law or halacha, mutar litol es damav. You could accept money, the kosef umalav ba'arkoshel oved kochavim, and draft the document in Gentile court, mipneishu kimatzal miyadam, because it's as if you're saving the money from the Gentiles' hands, i.e., you don't have to suffer an entire loss. So I will say, a very interesting case here. So it sounds like, so just two examples of this, where you have illegal transactions. I will say, I want to point out, the prohibition to sell a home in Eretz Yisrael to a non-Jew, according to Rashi's interpretation, is a biblical prohibition. So even though, again, that's biblical prohibition versus selling your eved, which is a rabbinic prohibition, but we're lumping them together, because what we're seeing over here is that when a transaction an illegal transaction is visited upon you, it would appear that halacha l'maisa, because you did not orchestrate it, you are permitted to go ahead and accept payment for it. So if the akum seizes my home, I could accept payment for the home. The akum seizes my eved, and I will say the interesting part over here also is, remember, this is the eved allowing himself to be captured. The point over here is, I had no hand in this transaction. This was foisted upon me. In that kind of scenario, halacha l'maisa, one would be permitted to go ahead and accept money for the transaction. Incredible. If one sells his eved to an oved kochavim, konsin also admeh bedamav. So I'll say, listen to this. So I'll say, so now remember, let's take a step back. So what did the Mishnah teach me? The Mishnah taught me that if I proactively sell my eved Kinani, to a Gentile master to Chutz La'aretz, what am I obligated to do? I'm obligated to go ahead and redeem him. You see, we'll say, the lashon of the Mishnah is, he goes free, right? Yatsa ben chorin. Rashi feels, what does it mean he goes free? What it means is I am obligated to redeem him. And then after I'm obligated to redeem him, what do I have to do? What do I have to do? Shtar shikr, and I'm obligated to free him. Suppose I said, obviously, in order to redeem him, what do I have to do? What do I have to do? I have to buy him back. So now I'll say, watch this. Now Rabbi Shmuel Levi says, by the way, you are obligated to buy him back for up to 100 times his value. So Rabbi says, so now this is incredible. Not only am I obligated to buy him back, not only am I obligated to free him upon repurchasing him, but I'm even obligated to buy him back. Rabbi Shmuel Levi says, up to 100 times his value. To which the Gemara says, whoa. Dafka olav. Now, I want to say, is that maybe like a bit hyperbolic? Just saying I have to buy him back, and even if I have to buy him back at a loss, in other words, that I have to buy him back for more money than I originally sold him for, I'm obligated, or does 100 literally mean 100 times his value? So Tashma Damrish Lakish, Hamocher Behema Gasli Ove Gochavim. If a person goes ahead and sells a Behema Gasa, a large animal, ultimately again to an Oved Kochavim. Right, and I will say now, right, let's discuss this. Person sells a large animal to an Oved Kochavim, Konsin Osad Sara Bedameha. You will penalize him that you have to buy back the animal up to 10 times its value. And I will say, what's going on over here with Behema Gasa? So remember again, there is a rabbinic prohibition to sell large beasts of burden, Behema Gasa, to an Akum. What are we concerned about? We're concerned that if you get used to selling large animals to Gentiles, you may come to what? Rent them to Gentiles as well. The concern over there is that the Gentile may then use the rented animal for work on Shabbos. And I will say, I have an obligation to ensure that not only do I not work on Shabbos, my animals are not permitted to work on Shabbos. If technically speaking, I have an animal rented out to the non-Jew, that is still my animal. If he works it on Shabbos, that is my problem. That's why you're not allowed to sell a behema gasa, a large animal, to a non-Jew. What happens if you did? So konsin also adasara b'damav. You have to buy back the animal for up to 10 times its value. To which again the Gemara says, dafka or lav dafka. Literally 10 times or figuratively 10 times. So Tashla the Reish Lagish, hamochar behema gasa le'vekochavim. If a person sells large animal to a Kochavim, konsin also admeya bidameha. Whoa. If you say, so behema gasa, you have to buy it back for up to 100 times its value. To which the Gemara says, shiny eved delo hadrele. So I will say, so it could very well be that halacha l'maisa, that it could very well be that by eved it's different. I'm sorry, did I skip? Yeah. So sorry. So Rabbi Shmuel Levi. I did skip. Yeah. So comes that says Rabbi Dilma. Okay. So that's what I'm saying. Hamochar behema gas love kochav. Konsen also ad asara bidameha. The Dilma. So we'll say. So by behema gasa, I have to buy him back for up to 10 times its value. Right. So the Gemara says. Vidilma shiny eved. Shabbos says, here's what's interesting. So by an eved, I have to buy him back for 100 times his value, up to 100 times his value. For a behema gasa, up to 10 times his value. Why the disparity? To which the Gemara says, Vidilma shiny eved. Yoma v'yoma mafkele b'mitzvos. We'll say maybe an eved is different. Why? Because an eved every single day that either he is owned by a non-Jew or every single day that he is outside of Eretz Yisrael, he is removed from the performance of mitzvos. Maybe because of that spiritual urgency, you have to buy him back no matter what, even up to 100 times his value. Others explain, Rabbi Shmuel Levi, Hamocher Avdol Ove Kochavim, Konsin also adasara b'damav. Oh, okay, this is a little bit more digestible over here. Well, see, an alternate version, Rabbi Shmuel Levi says, if you sold your Eved, you have an obligation to buy him back, and you have to buy him back for up to 10 times his value. Dafka or lav dafka? We'll say literally 10 times or figuratively 10 times. So Tasha Darmei Shlakish, Hamochar behema gasa, lo ove kochavim, konsen also admeya bidameha. Wow, but this is just the reverse, right? So Rabbi Shmuel Levi says, if you sell a behema gasa, you have to buy back the behema gasa for up to 100 times its value. To which the Gemara says, wow, what's the difference? Shiny Eved de lo hadule. Maybe I will say an Eved is different because remember, when you buy back your behema gasa, at least what? You get to keep it. It's yours. Eved, when you buy back your Eved, I will say, what happens when you buy back your Eved? he's automatically emancipated. Maybe that's why you only have to buy him back up to 10 times his value. Ella, behema time of mine, mishum dehadrele. Liknisei tfeichad. So I'll say, if that's the case, so I'll say, so I don't understand. If halacha l'maisa, the behema comes back, so I'll say, so fine. So if you have to buy back the evet for up to 10 times his value, buy back the behema for up to 11 times his value. I'll say, how do you go from 10 to 100? From 10 to 100. Ella, evet milsa de lo shchicha, or milsa lo shchicha lo gazir berabanan. Shabbos, that's very interesting. The Gemara says that people selling avodim to an akum, that is an uncommon occurrence. That's an uncommon occurrence. I would say, so because it's an uncommon occurrence, Chazal weren't really gozer. Because they weren't really gozer, therefore, again, if you do it, you only have to buy him back up to 10 times his value. The selling of a behema gasra, I'll say, on the other hand, could be a very common occurrence. How do Chazal ensure that you don't do it? By penalizing you what? Up to 100 times its value. So I will say, it appears from the conclusion of this Gemara, again, if we have just going to see in the Rambam, that Allah will say, so now what I know is, not only do I have an obligation to buy back the Eved if I sell them to a Gentile master, but what? I even have to buy him back up to 10 times his value. So also you see that clearly Chazal trying to disincentivize someone selling their Eved to an Akum or outside of Chuzaz, because we'll say, number one, you have to buy him back. Number two, you have to buy him back up to 10 times his value. Number three, when you buy him back, what do you have to do? You have to free him. You have to emancipate him. So this is a huge potential loss. Machar avda umes. What's the interesting case? What happens if Ruvain went ahead and sold his Eved and now he died? So I'll say, so Ruvain did something illegal. Ruvain sold his Eved Kanani to a non-Jewish master, and now Ruvain died. Mao Sheikh says, Beno Acharav. So we'll say, now Ruvain leaves behind the son. Does the son have an obligation to redeem the slave or not? And I will say, especially if we go with the idea that you have to redeem the slave up to 10 times its value, does the son have the obligation to do this or not? Suppose listen to this. There's a concept called Bechar Behema. You will say, what's ta'alacha? So you have to give your firstborn animal to the Kohen. What does the Kohen do with the animal? Halacha l'maisa, if he goes ahead, if the animal is unblemished, it gets offered up as a carbon, and the Kohen gets to eat the meat. If the carbon is if the animal is blemished, then the Kohen gets to keep it himself. So I will say, so here's an interesting case. Here's an interesting case. The halacha is, what happens if the Kohen purposely blemishes the animal himself? Kohen is a smart guy. He says, you know what? I don't want to give it as a carbon. I want to keep it. See, purposely, he cuts the ear. He purposely blemishes the animal. That's what it's called. So the Gemara says, there's a knas, there's a penalty there. So I'll say, so what happens if the Kohen blemished the Bechar and then the Kohen died? So I'll say, the son is penalized, right? The son has to carry out the penalty of the father. Maybe it's different in that case over there. Why? Mishum di isura da'araisahu. Because we'll say the father violated isura da'araisa. But here, the prohibition to sell an Eved is an Isser D'Rabbanan Amud Beis. Vimtim Salomar Kivein Malach. So we'll say, here the Shiloh over here is Ruvain, the father, illegally sold his Eved Kanani to a Gentile master. Now Ruvain died. Ruvain has a son. So now, does the son have an obligation to go ahead and redeem the Eved Kanani, even for, let's say, 10 times its value, or not? So I'll say, so now we're trying to figure this out. Imtim Salomar, Kivein Malachta B'moed Umeis. So it's another very interesting case. But I'll say the halacha is as follows. On Chalamayid, you're not allowed to do malacha. Can't do work. The only type of work that you're allowed to do for our purposes, the type of work you're allowed to do is what we call davar avad, bless you, something that's going to be lost, right? In other words, if you don't do something, you're going to suffer a loss. You could do that on Chalamayid. So I'll say, the one thing you can't do is, what happens if somebody purposely timed their work so that it will become a davar ha'avad, something that has lost the Chalamayid? I was going to give you a good example of this. The classic example of this is flax, right? The halacha is you have to soak flax for a certain amount of time, right? If you allow it to soak for too long, so what happens? It's lost. It's lost. So let's imagine the following situation. Let's say the flax has to soak for a day or 2 days. Someone purposely put in their flax on Erev Yantiv. on Erev Yantiv, right? So it's going to soak for Erev Yantiv, it's going to soak for the first day Yantiv, and then the first day Chalamayid, you're going to remove your flax. So now what have you done? You've purposely created a davar ha'avad scenario, right? You've purposely created it. So that's called kivein malachta b'moed umeis. And now what happens? So let's say, imagine Reuven purposely put his flax in the water on Erev Yantiv, and now he died. Lo kansu b'no acharav. So ultimately, we'll say we don't penalize the son. We allow the son to remove the flax. Why? Mishum d'lo avadi surah. Because again, the son didn't do anything, right? The son wasn't involved. Hacha mai lididei kansu rabbanan v'halei. Say so. We'll say in the case where Reuven sold the eved and then died. So do we say the knas is on Reuven, but Reuven's dead? Ol dilma lemamone kansu rabbanan v'ha'isei. We'll say hear this fascinating shaila. We'll say here's what we know, right? What does the Mishnah teach us? If a person sells his eved to a Gentile master or to Chutz La'aretz, what's the halacha? There's a knas, there's a penalty on the mat, right? There's a penalty. What's the penalty? What's the penalty? You have to buy back the eved for up to 10 times his value and then emancipate him. So here's the Gemara Shaila. Is the knas on the gavra, on the owner, on Reuven, or is it on the cheftza? Is it on the object? So I will say, what's the practical difference? Our case. Reuven died. Reuven died. So if you say that the knas is on the gavra, on Reuven, on the person, Reuven's dead, and therefore again his son will have no obligation to go ahead and redeem this eved. Or is the knas on the property, is the knas on the chefts, on the object, in this case the eved kanani, in which case again the object is still very much in existence, and maybe Reuven the son will have an obligation to go ahead and redeem the eved. So Tunisia, we learn this. Rose says in this case, Sada shnes kavtza b'shvius tiz l'matzishes. We'll say if you have a field, this is shmita. Shmita. So we'll say in this case over here, you have a field. You cleared the field of thorns during the shmita year. During the shmita year. So we'll say so. Ideally, this is not good, but midoraisa, this is not called working the field. Right? Clearing from thorns is not called working the field. Therefore, you're allowed to go ahead and work the field on Matzeh Shvius right after the Shemitah year. I'm sorry. Netaiba o nedaira lo tiz Matzeh Shvius. I'm saying here's an interesting case. What if you fertilize the field? So apparently there are two different ways that you could fertilize the fields. Netaiba Rabosai means that literally I brought fertilizer to the field and I spread fertilizer out on the field. The other mechanism for fertilizing, I will say, is called penning, right? What does that mean? I take animals and I pen them on different parts of the field. So I will say the field becomes naturally fertilized through the waste of the animals. Either way, if I fertilize the field during Shemitah, lo tizil matzeh shvius. I will say there is a penalty upon me, and I cannot plant that field after Shemitah. Naktinon hitiva umeis. So we're at the following scenario. What happens if halacha l'maisa, Reuven fertilized the field, right? Fertilized the field during Shemitah, illegal, and then he died. So what's the halacha? Bino zora. His son has the ability to plant that field after Shemitah. What do you see from here? Ama l'didei konstrabana lebrelo konstrabana. I will say, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, the knas is on the individual and not on the chefts. It's on the gavra, not the chefts. On the individual, not on the object. So once Reuven dies, halacha l'maisa, the knas dies along with him. Incredible. So therefore, again, what that seems to mean for us is that if Reuven illegally sold his eved kanani, and then what? And then Reuven died, Reuven's son does not have an obligation to go ahead and redeem the eved. So this is an interesting case. Okay, let's say Reuven went ahead and was metame the taros of his son. So I'll give you the following scenario. Imagine Reuven has a falling out with Aaron, right? Aaron's a Kohen. So what does Reuven do? He says, I'm going to get this guy. He throws a sheretz into Reuven's truma. Takes a dead mouse, throws it into Reuven's truma. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Now Reuven dies, umeis, lo kansu rabbanan b'no acharav. Now, obviously, by doing that, what did Reuven do? Reuven caused Aaron a loss. Now all the truma is no good. Now, interestingly enough, what's unique about this case, I will say, is this is called in halacha Hezek she'eno nikar, unrecognizable damage. Now, as I both say, if you were to look at that truma after the sharetz was thrown into it, assuming the sharetz was removed, right? Is there any recognizable damage to the truma? No. This is called unrecognizable damage. Shabbos say, now listen to this. So makes lo kansur rabbanan b'no acharav. Now Reuven dies. Reuven's son bears no culpability for the damage caused by his father. Says in my time, what's the reason for this? Hezek she'eno nikar lo shmei hezek. Ultimately, again, unrecognizable damage is not called damage. It's not called damage. To which the Gemara says, So I'll say, so now remember, so if hezek she'eno nikar is not called hezek, right? If unrecognizable damage is not called damage, then halacha l'maisa, why does Reuven himself have to pay? To which the Gemara says, Chazal only visited a knas. So what you begin to see over here is something very interesting. That whenever there is a rabbinic knas, rabbinic penalty, the rabbinic penalty only is vested or only is visited upon the perpetrator himself. But ultimately, again, the rabbinic penalty is not passed down generationally. So therefore, both say, same way by Truma, and it would appear, therefore, the Gemara's conclusion by the Eved case is, if Reuven illegally sold his Eved to a Gentile master, to Chutz La'aretz, and then Reuven died, that knas, the rabbinic penalty, is not passed down to the son. So rabbinic penalties go on the individual, not on the object. Therefore, once the perpetrator dies, no one else has liability for that rabbinic penalty, for that knas. Incredible. Olu Chutz La'aretz. So what happens now? We're speaking about selling the Evet to a Gentile master. What happens if you sold the Evet to Chutz La'aretz? So also there's a knas. You have to redeem the Evet and then emancipate him. Says the Torah Rabbanon, Hamocher Avdol Chutz La'aretz Yatzal Cherus V'tzarech Get Shichrar Me'Rabo Sheni. Interesting, I will say. If you went ahead and you sold your Evet to Chutz La'aretz, there was an Apache. The time over here is the following case. Reuven lives in Eretz Yisrael. He sold his Evet to Shimon, who lives in Chutz La'aretz, right? So now I will say, what happens? So ultimately, again, now the Eved goes free and he needs to get Shichra, a document of emancipation. Who does he need to get Shichra from? Now the Gemara says, from the second master, from Shimon. Omer, Pamim Yatza, Pamim Lo Yatza. Sometimes the Eved goes free, sometimes it doesn't go free. Ketzad, Omer Ploni Avdi Mechartiu Le Ploni Antuchi Lo Yatza. So let's listen to this. If Reuven says, Ploni my Eved, I sold him to so-and-so Antuchi, who is from Antuchia, right? Which is a place outside of Eretz Yisrael. Shabbos says, so ultimately, again, so Lemaisa, what the Gemara is saying is like this, is if Reuven sells his Eved, he knows that the buyer is from Chutz La'aretz, but he assumes that the buyer lives in Eretz Yisrael, right? Then ultimately, again, there is no penalty in that case. Lo yatsa. L'antuchi sheba Antuchia yatsa. But if Reuven sells his Evet to Shimon, who is from Antuchi and lives in Antuchia, i.e. he knows full well that Shimon lives in Chutz La'aretz, then what? Then ultimately, again, halach l'maisa, the Evet goes free. I have a Hatanya, we learned, L'antuchi yatsa. So, but we learned that if Reuven sold to Shimon, who the Antuchi, he is Yotze L'cherus, L'antuchi hashari belud lo yatsa. But if he sells it to Shimon, who is from Antuchia but lives in Lud, the Evet doesn't go free. Lo kashya had islay beisa be'eretz Yisrael, had islay ushbiza be'eretz Yisrael. So I will say this is fascinating. Gemara wants to make the following suggestion or the following distinction. If halacha l'maisa, Reuven sells to Shimon, right? He knows that Shimon is from Chutz La'aretz. But I will say, but watch this. But Shimon has a home in Eretz Yisrael. Then I will say, Reuven has every right to assume that Shimon is going to be remaining with his newly purchased Eved Kanani in Eretz Yisrael. If, however, Shimon doesn't have a home, what does Shimon do? He has a timeshare. So I'll say, a fixed Airbnb, right? He has a timeshare. So I will say, if he has a timeshare, that he cannot rely on the fact that he's going to live in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the assumption is he has sold that Evet to live in Chutz La'aretz, and therefore the penalty will kick in. So we'll say, bye, Rabbi Meir. So we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up a minute with this last case. But I will say, so bottom line, I just want to point out what we emerge with. Number one is the knas, right? Knas of selling the Evet to Chutz La'aretz, or ultimately again to an akum. Obligation to redeem seems to be even up to 10 times the value. Upon redemption, get shikrar, and Evet goes free. The knas does not pass down. So if the perpetrator dies, the knas dies along with him, and his son has no further obligation. Now we transition Rabosai to selling an Evet to Chutz La'aretz. Once again, the Evet goes free. Who has the obligation to go ahead and give the get shikrar? That Emeretz Hashem to be determined. Rabosai shkoyach. All right, Charan Zoom, have a great day, everyone. Oh my gosh, Shalom Aleichem. Thank you. I'm just saying, I'm just shutting this off.